So again, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us. I think we're going to get started. My name is Anita Nickerson. I'm the Executive Director of Fair Vote Canada. Thanks for joining us tonight, taking your time out for this important campaign to move the needle on proportional representation in BC. Before I go any further, I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the Indigenous land of many Indigenous peoples. There's people joining us from all across Turtle Island, and myself, I live in Kitchener, Ontario, which is the territory of the Neutral people, Haudenosaunee people, and Anishinaabe people. So what we're going to do in this webinar is each of our three guests are going to have about 10 minutes to speak to you. Now I'll introduce them one at a time. And then after that, we'll do some question and answer. So for those of you who are just joining us, just a reminder, the chat is for you to talk to each other. And we should also have Emerson from Fair Vote Canada should also be in the chat to help you with any questions, tech problems, resources, that kind of thing. And if you have questions for the panelists, put them in the Q&A and we will answer them after we give our guests a chance to speak. Okay, so I'm going to get started here and I'm going to introduce Rob Botterell, who's going to speak first. And I just want to say it's been a pleasure to be working with Rob over the last 6 or 7 months or whatever it is, working really hard to make progress on proportional representation in BC. And it's really always really nice to have a strong ally. It doesn't happen that often, and I really appreciate it. So Rob was elected MLA for Saanich North in the Islands in 2024. Rob has dedicated his career to fighting for social and economic justice, as well as environmental protection. His previous work included representing First Nations governments in private law for over 25 years, as well as positions as the financial, and I can't say this word, comptroller, Rob.
Yeah, yeah.
Did I
Yeah,
get it?
great. You
All
got
right.
it.
Okay. So that's not my world, obviously. A financial comptroller for a major Canadian bank, a public servant in the Ministry of Finance, and leading the team responsible for developing provincial laws relating to freedom of information. Rob has lived on the Saanich Peninsula for many years, now calling Pender Island home. Rob represents the Green Party on the BC's All-Party Democratic and Electoral Reform Committee, so he's been right in the heart of this work for many months now. I've asked Rob to just provide an overview of the work the committee did, the recommendations related to electoral reform, where things stand now, and any personal reflections that he'd like to share about what's happened so far and the moment that we're in now. So I'll turn off my camera and ask the others to do the same, and we'll hand it over to Rob.
Great. Thanks so much, Anita. I really can't say how much I appreciate this opportunity to update folks and also to really express my appreciation directly for the huge amount of effort that Fair Vote Canada and all of you have put into bringing your views and perspective and expertise over developed over many years to the Special Committee on Democratic and Electoral Reform. I'm going to try and be brief, which is not in my nature, but I'll briefly describe a bit of the history of how we got to today. I'll talk a bit about where things are at, recognizing that I won't be speaking to any specific negotiations around the renewal of our Carga agreement because that's all confidential and under NDA, and then really just conclude by offering some thoughts on the path forward from here. I also want to emphasize that just looking in the chat, some of you have way more expertise than I do in this. I'm relatively new in terms of developing knowledge and expertise around this, and then there are others that this will be maybe your first experience learning about what we're doing in BC. And so forgive me if some of this is old hat for some of you. I'm just going to go back as far as the early 2000s, where in 2004 there was a citizens' assembly. I think that's the right year. And ultimately, following that, there was a referendum where there was roughly 57.7 and 58% in support of moving to a system of pro rep that had been recommended by the Citizens Assembly. That was less than the supermajority threshold, so it didn't proceed. There was another referendum later on, and then when the Greens had a CASA agreement with the NDP in 2018, we had a another referendum, and that referendum involved a pretty complex question. At the time, I thought you needed a PhD to understand what the question meant or how to answer it, and that referendum failed. Um, and pretty much everybody, including Premier Eby, recognized now that that question was impossibly complex. And then fast forward to around this time uh, earlier uh, in 2025, we completed negotiations following the provincial election for an agreement with the NDP, and the we call it CARGA, Cooperation Responsible Government Accord, and in that agreement. We negotiated to have a special committee on democratic and electoral reform struck to have another look at all aspects of democratic and electoral reform, and that was driven by the increasing political polarization that's taking place, the lack of engagement or need for much greater engagement and voter participation. And so the committee's work was much broader than just electoral systems, but we did make it clear that in the terms of reference that would be a focus, and so we got to work. And the committee ultimately is comprised of five NDP MLAs, two Conservative MLAs, one Green, that's me, and then one member of one BC, which was added later on. So a total of nine members, cross party, all parties represented. We traveled around the province and heard in-person presentations, and we also spent a couple of weeks in Victoria hearing both video and in-person presentations, and then written submissions. And where we landed at the end of that hearing process was we had roughly 1,000 submissions. 442 of them were in favor of moving to some form of proportional representation. 28 were opposed to pro rep and supported first past the post. And then, as you know, subsequent polling that Fair Vote Canada conducted demonstrated that the fact that there's a huge number of folks in our hearings that supported pro rep and made very articulate, passionate presentations around types of proportional representation, whether to have a referendum or not, the particular system, all of the aspects. And, you know, the ECOS poll demonstrated that 75% of folks in British Columbia support a system that makes party representation proportional to the percentage of vote, which is not something that First Past the Post does. And certainly, the Fair Vote Canada review of the submissions demonstrated that 93% of those that made submissions on pro rep or on the electoral system supported pro-rep. Um, we had lots of presentations around referenda, and the presentations were pretty unequivocal that they're not the preferred approach to making complex decisions. And there were a couple of presentations that really went into a lot of detail on the problems with referendums. Um, so then what happened was we had lengthy deliberations on electoral system options, and you can see in the report that there's a fairly lengthy section summarizing those presentations. And where the committee landed, and this is a recommendation of the committee as a whole, was that we didn't really have the time and the expertise to reach a final conclusion on whether to go with ProRep, and in particular, whether a particular system of ProRep. And we recognized we didn't have expert advisors. We're politicians. There's always a sense that even though we're all party, is it really a reflection of public input? So where we landed was that we needed further conversations with British Columbians to ensure support for and public trust in changes to the system of elections, and that the appropriate way to do that would be to convene a new citizens assembly supported by experts, and that committee would have fairly open-ended terms of reference. What type of system will make it most proportional, both in terms of proportional rep, but the specific system? How do we make sure rural-urban representation is equitable? How do we make sure that there's accountability to individual voters, and there's that link there? How do we ensure stable government, increased voter engagement, more collaboration, and reduced polarization? And we had a lot of discussion, both the presenters and on our committee, around looking at jurisdictions like the one just south of us, and the degree of polarization there. And then a system that makes sure we look at all the policy options. And so what we did was we recommended consideration for the establishment of a citizens assembly. That report has been tabled in the legislature, and we're at the moment in time where the government is considering what to do with not just that recommendation, but 35 other recommendations. So that's pretty much where things stand. There were some folks that made fairly passionate recommendations about let's just do it. Let's just start with pro-rep right away. There were others that said we should have another referendum, so there were lots or implement and have a referendum later. But our perspective on it was that we really need to do the work, and that the committee wasn't equipped to do the work to build that public involvement and support for a particular approach. And the Citizens Assembly seemed like the right way to go. Certainly, it's what we're recommending. It's a different world than the early 2000s, and there's been a lot of academic work done on the benefits of pro-rep, and so that's the work that would need to get done. I'll just make a couple of final remarks, and I'm probably going over time here, so I'll be quick. I over the Christmas holiday, as I developed my knowledge around this, I read John Horgan's late former premier John Horgan's biography, And I was encouraged by the fact that he also felt that the question was was, as he quote, David Eby came back with a ballot that was very hard to understand and sold it to cabinet. And so eventually they went with that, obviously, but he acknowledged, Premier Horgan at the time acknowledged that it was, and in this biography acknowledged the complexity. And then I found this very helpful. I would still like to see proportional representation, quote unquote. And I think that the work that we would do through a citizens assembly is build an understanding of a specific approach to pro rep in this time, and that we would it wouldn't be a political process. It would be a process governed by citizens across the province, selected randomly with expert support. And I think that lays the foundation for actually deciding in a definitive way whether pro rep is the right approach, and if so, what is the specific type. And then that lays the foundation to actually have it happen. And that's where we're headed. So I'm very hopeful that over the next month, or by the time the legislature reconvenes, we'll have a really thorough discussion over this with government, and we'll hear what government wants to do with this specific recommendation. And it may seem like a small step, but I think it would be a very positive step, and we'll see what happens. I'll just stop there.
I'm muted. There we go. Thanks, Rob. Thanks for giving us all that overview. It helps to have you cover the ground, for where we started a year or so ago and where we are now. Yeah, I wanted to just highlight something that Rob mentioned, you know, just the fact, it only really hit me the other day, the fact that an all-party committee came to a recommendation to do something actually useful and constructive. I've been out doing this for a long time, and I've never seen that before. Usually, when politicians get together to talk about this, it ends in paralysis, partisan roadblocks, no consensus, and all that kind of stuff. I mean, we've been having committees in this country since 1920s. So for all these different political perspectives to say that they would like a citizens assembly, and for one of the key principles for them to look at is proportionality, is really a big positive step forward. So I'm going to invite Shoni now. There you are. All right, I'm going to introduce Shoni. So it's great to see Shoni. Shoni was here in Faribault, Canada when I came in, and I'm so grateful she's still here. So I'm going to read her bio. Shoni Field was a member of BC's 2004 Citizens Assembly on Electoral Reform that recommended proportional representation by the single transferable vote. She campaigned during BC's 2005 and 2009 referendums. Shoni has been a director of Fair Voting BC, and she was at one time the president of Fair Vote Canada when I was on the board many years ago. She chaired Vancouver's 2016 Independent Election Task Force, which recommended PR for Vancouver. In her professional life, Shoni works as the BC SPCA's Chief Public Engagement and Advancement Officer. She's a strategic public engagement leader with nearly 30 years of experience specializing in fundraising, digital transformation, public engagement, strategic growth planning. So I've asked Shoni to speak about, from her own experience, why she thinks a citizens' assembly can be a valuable tool for legislators, looking at how to design a proportional system. And I've also asked her to speak to, why after 20, actually now we're 22 years later, 22 years later, she's still involved in this cause and fighting for proportional representation, and why she thinks it still matters a lot now. Okay.
Thanks, Anita. So I'm going to cover that, but I'm also going to cover a couple of things that I think are the sort of a lot of people can talk about the mechanics of citizens' assemblies and why proportional representation is important for democratic stability. And I want to talk about the things that are specific to me having been a citizens' assembly member that I think will be important in these next stages of our work. So I'm going to jump back. In 2005, I was on the CBC the morning after the May 17th referendum. I was being interviewed about my feelings of the results. And I remember saying that I really hoped that we'd be in BC, we'd be the first in Canada to adopt proportional representation. And then I said, well, maybe we'd be the last, but I believe that we'll get there. And so 21 years later, we've come a huge distance in public support, and Fair Vote Canada has done a lot of really important work in building that up. Um, and we're in the position of potentially being the first in Canada again. So this is a really important opportunity ahead. And I know Fair Vote Canada is calling on people to contact their MLAs to support the all-party recommendation, to encourage other citizens to also do that work. And that's really important work. This opportunity doesn't come around a lot. So this is why I want to help. I'm presuming that you're all going to jump in. Some of you I've seen in the chat are already doing this work. So I'm presuming that most people are going to be part of this work. And I want to talk about some things that I think are going to be really important when you have that conversation with your MLA. The things that they're going to say to that maybe will be not as positive. So I'm going to talk about three myths and one really big important truth. So in our work in the last 21 years, I've heard a lot that, and certainly going into our work in the Citizens Assembly, that we were too polarized in BC for ordinary people to come to a consensus, that this was beyond the capacity of ordinary people. And I have a lot more faith in my fellow citizens now than I did in January 2004. It's really easy going into that big room in the WASC Center the first time and saying, well, I think I could do this, but I'm not sure about this person and this person. But this experience I went through really brought me to the point of having this huge amount of faith in entrusting these complex and thoughtful policy decisions to citizens. But at the time, BC was really known as the polarized Wild West of politics. Still is at some points. So this is what we were equipped for. We were sort of set up to be distrustful. So myself and other members, it was a huge surprise for us when we started working together and listening to British Columbians. And we found the British Columbians were united with a shared vision of how politics should work, that there should be civility, there should be stability, there should be consensus, and a recognition that our system polarizes us rather than incentivizing these shared values. So we need to point this out when we call on MLAs to support the all-party recommendation. Far from being too polarized for ordinary folk, a citizens' assembly may actually be our only, or at least our best chance of reaching consensus in this bringing forward this sort of shared vision for how politics should operate. The second myth that I've heard a lot is that assemblies are anti-politician inherently. And this is a really damaging one because we need politicians to support us in order to come into being. So we have to address this. And some people mistake a nonpartisan assembly focused on voter needs as anti-politician. But I want to talk for a moment about why members and politicians actually have more in common than not. Because while we were statistically representative of BC through random selection, we did also have to self-select. We did have to agree, once we got that letter, we had to agree to give up a year of our time. And when they studied Citizens Assembly members afterwards, they found that members were more likely to be volunteers in their community, more likely to be engaged in their community. So the members of citizens' assemblies are those who believe that they have a responsibility to try to make their communities, their provinces, their countries a better place. And those same motivations are why people often first run for office. And so over the course of that year, there was a lot of empathy for how difficult it is for our community leaders to be the representatives that they want to be. And there was a lot of conversations about, can we remove some of those barriers to make it easier? So it's not anti-politician to recognize that there is a distrust aggravated by our structure that we need to address. It's not anti-politician to do our work with a deep understanding that representative democracy only works when kind and caring people step up. And it's not anti-politician to want to remove barriers that prevent our elected officials from being the representative politicians that they first dreamed of being. So when talking to MLAs, I think it's really important to find that common ground, to look at that shared value between electoral reform advocates and MLAs, and members on the assembly, that these are a group of people who believe in trying to make their communities, their province, their countries a better place. But I also want to acknowledge that in the context of 2004, elected MLAs deliberately did not engage with the Assembly, whether out of a commitment to its nonpartisan nature, they weren't given an official role, or because it was not expected to conclude successfully, so there was perceived to be high risk and little reward to engaging. So my personal belief is that we have to neutralize this potential criticism by finding a way to incorporate the lived realities of MLAs into assembly learnings in some way. And that may be something we need to acknowledge as we go and talk to MLAs. Now, the third and I think the most damaging myth that we'll hear is that assembly members can be led. I've been told by multiple MPs, MLAs, a couple of mayors, handful of political scientists, researchers, post-grad students, authors, researchers, political party staffers, that my fellow members were led. We were bamboozled by experts. We are incapable of independent thought and manipulated into our decisions. And I've been told this without the courtesy of asking, simply as a statement of fact. So first I'm going to talk about what really happened, but then I'm going to talk about how I think we need to address this when we're going out and having these conversations. So here's what led to this. In our 9th month of learning and deliberations, after hundreds of hours, after reading thousands of public submissions, we started to lean towards recommending the single transferable vote system instead of the more expected mixed member proportional system. And it surprised people. So we had all these public submissions and dozens of public presentations, and there was varying degrees of knowledge. And we decided to level the playing field amongst all citizens who participated by really honing in on what were the shared values that people brought to the table. And the shared values that came through rural, urban, old, young, right, left, first past the post, or STV, or mixed member proportional, is people were looking for effective local representation, enhanced voter choice, and accurate or proportional results. And so, like Poli-Sci 101, even our research directors shared a lot of the conventional wisdom about how each system delivered on these values. And we questioned that. Behind the scenes, between our weekend sessions, our online forum was humming. We were talking to political scientists around the world. We were reading research papers. We were analyzing data. We were even running our own statistical models. And we came back to our next session with the knowledge that we needed to debunk some commonly held assumptions. And in choosing between MMP and STV, we found that they both increased voter choice, but in different ways. MMP was thought to be better in proportionality and STV on local representation. But our modeling showed that our STV model and our MMP model would deliver essentially the same level of proportionality. Therefore, we were able to choose as the best match for all three of British Columbia's core voting system values at that time, the values that were there in 2004. That's not to say they'd be the same values today. So we could have proportionality, we could have choice, and we could strengthen local representation. So it's sort of ironic that we were being accused of being led while doing the exact opposite, confounding predictions and exercising independent thought. But this has become a key counter-argument against assemblies. Media and politicians, when commenting on the role of citizens' assemblies, feel that they need to offer this as a balance. They'll say, well, first, there's the worry that democratic experts who provide members with the basis of knowledge regarding different systems and manage discussions may unduly influence the assembly's deliberations. So 20 plus years in, I found it more effective to lead with a good offense rather than the defense of what actually happened. I remind the speaker that selection was random. It could have been them. Are they saying they don't think they personally could study a topic for a year and come to an independent conclusion? Most people think they would be capable of doing that. I asked them to think of the volunteers, the active citizens, the helpers in their community. Do they think those citizens aren't capable? Those people really holding up the community? And I talk about why this is a problematic myth, because when we perpetuate this, we diminish the perceptions of citizens' capacity. And when we diminish citizens, we diminish democracy. And we're seeing some of those, those threats to democracy. And I think we all understand we can't afford to diminish perceptions of citizens' capacity right now. We need all of the sort of champions of democracy to be operating at full capacity. So I then wrap up with pointing out that given the threats to democracy, it is becoming increasingly important that we recognize that citizens arguably have the least bias in choosing how we hire our politicians. So I just want you to keep these three myths in mind because they get in the way of the real role of a citizens' assembly and they will come up in your conversations and you will need to address them. There's one additional truth that I want to talk about. Not only are citizens' assemblies a critical health check for our democratic representation, is our system fit for purpose, but it's also therapeutic. Citizens' assemblies, when done well, have a powerful potential to start to rebuild voter trust. And that's just the impact of the work itself, not even getting to the recommendation. So citizens' assemblies deliver on those key components of psychological well-being. They deliver opportunities for citizens to feel accountable, connected, and competent. And when you're delivering that type of psychological well-being, you're creating the conditions for trust. And you can say, well, sure, being a member was transformative for you, but there was only 160 of you and there's 5.7 million British Columbians. So how does that help? But actually, British Columbians experience these benefits by proxy. I've been told thousands of times, people said, I wish I'd got one of those letters. I was following right along with you. I wanted to be part of that. You represented me. In UBC polling just before the 2005 referendum, it showed that a vast majority of British Columbians felt that they'd heard directly from a Citizens Assembly member. Now, that's impossible that we had one-to-one conversations, but they knew of us in the communities. They knew someone who knew someone. They felt that we represented them. So citizens' assemblies can re-engage a distrustful electorate and renew confidence that our democracy can be both stable and responsive, and it can give voters hope that there can be a way for them to meaningfully engage in the political process. And I think those are all things we desperately need. So we have a really excellent opportunity ahead of us in BC, and all of us as champions of voting reform, I'm really hoping everyone will step up and try and make the most of this because these don't come all the time. I think I've gone a little bit over, but I'll turn it back to Anita. Thank you.
Thank you, Shoni. Thanks for so many points and for being, so inspiring as always, reminding us that citizens can be trusted to do the work. And I really like how you talked about how politicians often do get into politics for the right reasons, and that the work of the legislature and of our representatives can complement the work of a citizens' assembly really nicely. So I'm going to turn it over now to Dennis. And so Dennis, I'm sure many of you know Dennis, is the chair of York University's Political Science Department, and he is an expert in electoral reform. He's the author of numerous articles, book chapters, and 2 books on the topic, including The Politics of Voting, Reforming Canada's Electoral System, and Wrestling with Democracy, Voting Systems as Politics in the 20th Century West. So I've asked Dennis to talk about how other countries got proportional representation, how PR happens in the real world, and the role that citizens' movements like ours, regular people, can play in making a breakthrough for PR.
Great. Well, thanks, Anita, and thanks for everybody for coming out tonight. I think you left out the most important information about me, which is I'm a BC boy, grew up in BC and lived all over BC. I lived in all of the municipalities of Vancouver. I lived in Williams Lake. I lived in Cassiar, very close to the Yukon. My first radio job was in Smithers, British Columbia. I lived in Port McNeill and Victoria. So I've been in a lot of places, and BC is a great place. And I agree with Shoni that, I was hoping that 2005 was going to be the breakthrough for voting system reform in the country. It certainly wasn't because VC hadn't led in the past. We had certainly seen a lot of effort, and particularly at the municipal level in British Columbia back around World War I. Just to give you a sense of where I'm coming from, as Anita said, I've written two books on voting system reform. My book, The Politics of Voting, you can find it on my Academia EDU site. You just put Dennis Pilon into Google, and you can find the whole thing for free. And it takes up a lot of the questions that I'm seeing in the chat. So for those of you who are like, oh, I want to know about Israel and Israel, Italy and Israel, people keep asking me about that. Or what about voter turnout? I cover all those issues and more in the book. And so for those of you that want to get a primer on the issues, you can get one for free and you can pester me with questions afterwards about any aspects of the book. The other book I've written called Wrestling with Democracy looks at 18 countries over 150 years. It looks at every instance of national voting system reform across Western countries. So, I mean, the topic that I've spent a great deal of time, in fact, the lion's share of my academic career on, is on this question of how we make change in our institutions. And how do we go from not democracy to democracy? Because often that's not very well discussed. In fact, a lot of it's just assumed. So let me just run over some basic themes, and then I think we need to turn it over to the questions and things that you want to talk about in the time that we have left. So let me put out a couple of truisms that are drawn from my research and maybe aren't well known by people about voting system reform. And I'm talking about countries that are comparable to Canada. So I'm talking about other Western industrialized countries. It doesn't help us to compare us to, say, Africa or Latin America, where the whole process was so different. We want to compare ourselves to countries that have similar economic and political development to us. And it's interesting that most countries, most Western countries, use proportional voting systems. Most of them have used it for over 100 years. And most of them got their PR not with referendums. In fact, only two Western countries got their PR by referendums. Switzerland in 1918 and New Zealand in the 1990s. So it's very rare for a referendum. Almost every country that has got PR has gotten PR through a multi-party agreement that is simply introduced through their legislative process. And of course, we've had plenty of voting system reform in this country already. We've had 10 voting system reforms at the provincial level in this country. Every single one of them simply introduced by its legislature. No referendum involved. In fact, British Columbia changed its voting system in the 1950s. From first past the post to a ranked ballot system, and then back to first past the post, and they did it with a simple vote in the legislature. So what we see here is often a real kind of double standard because there's been a bias in the choosing process for Canada and our provincial voting systems that has tended to benefit those who are already in power. In Canada, the country was founded and its institutions were instituted before we were really democratic. And so they were designed to serve the elites who were keen to keep control of the political system. And this is true in all cases of democracy. You know, when we look at the broad 200 years of struggle over democracy across Western countries, it's always been the same. Those with power don't want to give it up. And those who need power, the great unwashed masses, they have to go demanding it. They have to struggle. They have to take advantage of openings to try to get more democracy. And in Canada, these institutions like first past the post or bicameralism, these were entrenched before the people really had a look in on what was going on. And that makes it much harder to change afterwards. I mean, here's an interesting point. Not a single democratizing country that's starting from zero has ever chosen first past the post. They just don't do it. If we look at the countries that were redemocratizing after World War II, again, Western countries, all chose PR. If we look at the countries that were coming out of dictatorships in the early 1970s, like the Southern European countries, all chose PR. If we look at the Latin American countries that were returning to democracy in the 60s and 70s, all chose PR. I mean, it's quite consistent. All of the former communist countries all chose PR. So this idea that somehow first past the post is somebody's choice, only when there's a gun to your head. First past the post is not chosen by any group of people who are in a position to make the choice for themselves. First past the post is maintained by those who want to maintain an overarchingly undemocratic or unrepresentative system. You know, to me, and I've been studying this topic now for about 35 years, the choice is really very simple. It's not a choice between systems. It's a choice between democracy or not democracy. I mean, again, if you go back to the early struggles over democracy, it was absolutely obvious to everyone, even the opponents, that PR was a more democratic system. No one disputed that. No one argued that PR was less democratic. Everybody knew it was more democratic. The argument was whether people wanted democracy or not. And the anti-democrats were just much more honest in the past. They were much more honest about, look, we don't want the great unwashed interfering in our decisions, and that's why we want to keep first past the post. Today, of course, it's harder to get that degree of honesty. But really, today, the arguments in favor of first past the post are an oligarch's argument. They are often authoritarian arguments. They're arguments that say, well, the people can't be trusted. Democracy is going to lead to bad stuff. You got to let elites make those decisions. I mean, not one of them is a democratic argument. So, in that way, it's a very simple decision. And I would caution against claims that our failures mean that our issue is dead. That's certainly something we often hear, right? Oh, well, we've heard this before. You didn't win the referendum, so go away. Nobody cares about that issue anymore. In every single historical example that I could give you, there were decades of debate and struggle over the voting system before those countries adopted PR, precisely because there were entrenched interests who were desperate to maintain a system that leveraged power in their favor and kept it away from everyone else. And every example I could give you, if we were talking about Belgium, if we were talking about Germany, it just goes on and on. I could wheel out the historical story that goes on for tens of years in terms of trying to take those systems forward. And they don't go forward by logic or argument, sadly, as we might think. They go forward by taking advantage of unpredictable opportunities, openings where the anti-democrats are on the back foot and the democratic forces are moving forward. It's not accidental that shifts to PR often occurred during or after world wars, because those were also periods of mass mobilization where traditional elites lost some of their grip on the control of these political systems. And don't forget, even New Zealand, which we often hold up as our poster child of recent reform, took more than 2 decades to make the change that they accomplished. So I guess what I'm saying is, don't be discouraged. It feels like we're spinning our wheels sometimes, but what we're doing is, consistently building our capacity to make our arguments, to make our claims, and put ourselves in a position to take advantage of an opening when the opening finally comes forward.
Thank you, Dennis. I think the most important message I heard there was don't give up. It can take decades of struggle, but the moment that we don't expect can also open up like this. Like look what is happening in the United States. There's things you can't predict in politics, and the things that were impossible suddenly become entirely possible almost overnight. And so our job is to build, like you said, keep pushing, keep growing, build our capacity. So thank you thanks for that perspective, Dennis. So I'm going to take some questions now. I've grabbed a few out of the chat. So I thought I'll start with the ones that are the most relevant to the situation here in BC and the politics of it and things people want to know. So I think this is Shoni. Do you want to join us again? Put your camera on. There you are.
My buttons are not cooperating tonight.
It's okay. So I guess one of the questions I'm seeing sort of recurring a little bit in the Q&A is, I would say, the usual and understandable skepticism about the other big parties. I mean, I realize the right is kind of fractured right now, but is there reason to hope that BC NDP and BC Conservatives are open-minded to progress on this idea, or is it just the Green Party, basically? That's the question I'm going to throw out to Rob and anybody else who wants to answer it.
Sure, yeah. No, that would be a question on my mind too. And from my perspective, what we have is we have an all-party recommendation to consider a citizens assembly. And, as with other legislative special committee reports, all of these recommendations are up for consideration. And it's the NDP that have to consider it. It's the NDP government that ultimately has to decide whether or not to proceed with that particular and other recommendations. Um, in my conversations with NDP members, uh, there's a I mean, most NDPers voted for pro rep when it was in a referendum type of style. That's anyway. And this is anecdotal, but that's sort of the impression I get. And so I think that the NDP are going to seriously consider this, and I understand that Premier Eby has made some pretty clear statements, at least from his perspective on this issue. But I think ultimately the NDP are a party, and they're not a party of one. And to the extent that caucus members and cabinet ministers hear your voice and hear the compelling case for doing this, I can't guarantee what the percentage is, but it's not a wasted effort. It's a huge help to keeping that education going, because so often what happens is people misunderstand what a citizens assembly entails. And some will say, oh, okay, so we're implementing pro rep. No, 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 that's not. We had a clear and lengthy discussion about the path forward, because we don't want to see a change in electoral system that doesn't have, a confirmation of a broad base of support and an understanding. Sorry, I'm going on, but an understanding and a consensus built about what system. And that's important. There were hundreds of submissions. Lots of them differed on the particular system. We didn't have the expertise to say which one. It's not, the citizens should have a role in choosing the system. So, long and short of it is that the next couple of weeks is hugely helpful to do check-ins with MLAs and cabinet ministers, and just hear what's on their mind, because they may misunderstand what's being proposed, and you may have, as Shoni was saying, some great answers for sort of those questions that people have that they've just assumed the answer to.
The NDP's position has been an interesting one over the past 100 years. And one of the things that I think people could benefit from knowing is that many of the early electoral reforms were explicitly designed to frustrate the CCF and the NDP. The transferable ballot, the ranked ballot, was introduced in British Columbia in 1952, was explicitly designed to keep the CCF from power. And because there was a coalition of conservative and liberals, and they were working together for about 10 years, but they didn't want to work together anymore. And so the way they unraveled their coalition, but didn't allow the NDP to sort of come up the middle, and the CCF, there was a CCF then, to come up the middle, was to introduce this ranked ballot. It was completely cynical. It had nothing to do with democratic ideas. It was all about power. And so too, some of the other reforms that we saw introduced at the municipal level in this country at different points were very much about how can we beat up on that other group. So that's part of what has informed the New Democrats' approach to voting system reform. While other left-wing parties in other Western countries supported PR, parties like the NDP or the CCF NDP tended to be influenced by the British Labour Party. And the British Labour Party said, no, 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 we don't want PR. Let's just wait until the system works in our favor. The problem for the CCF NDP was it was taking a long time to work. The CCF didn't get their crack in BC until 72 when they'd become the NDP. And of course, federally, they've never had their crack. So what we find with the NDP is that where the party is far from power, they tend to be more interested in PR. Where the party has some experience of power, and traditionally Manitoba, Saskatchewan, British Columbia, well, that's where you find some of the biggest opposition to PR. So, Yeah, that's the kind of situation we're in. I would agree with Rob that the party is not one entity or one voice. There are different voices within the party, and we've seen leadership on PR from the NDP. But I think amongst the membership, the voice is much more consistent in favor of PR. And so that's where I think pressure can be brought to bear on the party to say, look, the members want to see some movement on this, even if the tacticians in the party are like, no, don't talk about that. We're going to get all the power.
And I think
Joni?
the it's all about taking the opportunities that come up. Like the opportunity for the 2004 Citizens Assembly was because we'd had a wrong winner and we'd had the complete wiping out of an official opposition. Two elections in a row where people were like, oh, regardless of how I voted, this is not working. And it's potential that we have this a window coming again with the threats and polarization we're seeing to democracy. The more, I mean, Fair Vote Canada is doing some great work calling attention to, the likelihood of having war as as a proportional country and the dangers, the instability and dangers you have of a very small manipulation and a very small shift in voting leading to a fascist state or leading to a dangerous attack on democracy. And as scary as some of the things we're seeing is right now, there's also the opportunity to say, this is like really important to shore up democracy at this point. So I think that's one of the windows in at this point.
Yeah. I just want to kind of reiterate what Shoni's saying. A lot has happened since 2018. And this, since the 2018 referendum. So, of course, the opponents always say this is done and dusted and decided, and we're not reopening this kind of thing. But in politics, 6 or 7 years is like 100 years ago. And I mean, so much has changed in the world and in terms of who's in power and what the openings are and what the real threats are. And voting reform isn't something people wake up and think about over their breakfast. They thought about it maybe very briefly 7 years ago. So it's not done for them. It's not done. And that's why we have to, speak up when we have a chance. I just want to say one more thing, Dennis, about what Rob said about NDP membership. When we started doing Visit Your BC NDP MLA back in February, I didn't really know what to expect. And frankly, I didn't expect very much of a warm reception. And I was pleasantly surprised to find how many open-minded and supportive MLAs there were. And when we had volunteers outside the BC NDP convention, everybody that stopped by on their way in said, yeah, I support this. So it's the members broadly support it. And what we need to do is mobilize pressure towards the leadership so that they can see that. Dennis.
Very briefly, I see in the comments a lot of frustration from people about why are we just repeating what we're doing? Why, we've already done, and I agree with you. And let's be clear. The only reason that we've had this recent conversation was because the NDP did not win a majority and they needed support from the Greens. It's about power. And that is ultimately the opening that we are going to see. I totally appreciate all of your attention and your interest in all the details. And one-on-one, it's important to go into those things. But ultimately, this is not going to be about the best argument. It's going to be about the political moment where leverage can be made, where the party system is in such disarray that the big parties are going to have to make a deal with some of the other parties. And the price of that deal has got to be PR. Now, I'm all for citizens' assemblies, for working out the details, of choosing the model, but we are way past a discussion about whether we need PR or not. PR is the answer. It's not going to solve all our problems, but it is definitely the step forward for democracy that we need. And the opening will be when power is not wholly in anyone's hands.
And just to jump in on that point, the the work that a citizens assembly would do would be to package it up so it's ready for that moment. Because I, as a lawyer that practiced for 25 years for First Nations across this province, I can tell you of dozens of times when in this unexpected moment, the province or the federal government came forward and said, hey, we're ready to do something. and then we had to say, well, sorry, we're not ready. And so if you think about the Citizens Assembly, it is the way where we have this ready to go on the shelf at that moment where the power dynamics or the leverage is such or the thoughts, the views, create that window to do it. And will that happen in the next 3 months, 6 months, 6 years, 3 years? Who knows? But if we're not ready at that moment to take that opportunity and go through the door, we're going to be sitting here for 100 years.
Mhm.
And I think there's some comments in the chat around, why are we doing this again? We've designed a system, and I think it's important for this group of people as we go out and champion this. Don't don't get divided by this system or that system. We'd have PR. We'd have had PR for 4 or 5 elections now in BC if voting reform folks had said any flavor of PR is better than first past the post. And we need to do this now. We can say, why are we going back when the Citizens Assembly in 2004 designed a system? The times have changed. Representation has changed. Our considerations have changed. The values may not be the same. They may come up with a different answer of a model of PR. As long as it's PR, I'm voting for it. I don't care it's all much better. And there's far greater opportunity 2 elections down the road to say, do we need to tweak it a little or iterate, than to say, we're holding out for our preferred model and we're sure we're going to get another opportunity really quickly. And that doesn't happen. So, let's identify, let's recognize that the world has changed since 2004. And hopefully, I believe really strongly that I have trust in a group of citizens to come together and they'll design a system that really meets the needs for BC right now. And whatever that system is, we need to put everything we have behind getting that in place.
Yeah. I think the frustration of that people are expressing, why are we going through this yet again? And BC has been through this so many times.
Yeah.
Trust me, I get it, but
Yeah.
we can't wave a magic wand and make the people with the power want to give up the power. That's not the way it works. There's logic and then there's politics. And in the politics, we have a small window of opportunity in the next 3 or 4 weeks to push for another inch of progress. If we do not push, we don't have any chance of getting a citizens assembly. If we don't have any chance of getting it, then we don't continue the conversation and we're not ready, we're not stronger, and we're not ready for that moment. So we have to push for that inch. And I suppose this is sort of I don't mean to be a bad note to end on, but I'd like to address the elephant in the room here of David Eby's very discouraging comments and what the three of you would say to that, because I know I have my own thoughts on that. Has everybody heard? Do you all know what I'm talking about?
Wasn't it words to the effect that, BC's moved on, we're not interested in this anymore?
It was
Something like
basically
that?
like we've had 3 referendums or something, and he was traumatized by the last one. So
Well, I'll
so
answer that question right
thank
off.
you, Rob.
The first thing is that uh, we're not negotiating in the media.
Mhm.
I'm not going to say anything more. We are not negotiating in the media, not the Greens, not the NDP. And so just bear that in mind. I see a lot of comments about what should we be doing as Greens or what should the NDP doing. We don't negotiate in the media. We are negotiating a renewal of Carga, and that's a negotiation. The second point is that I totally respect the fact that Premier Eby can state his position on any number of issues in a fairly unequivocal way. And, what we've seen with Premier Eby is that on occasion, he changes his position. In fact, at times last spring, we were in a humorous way, basically describing the premier as Premier Flip Flop on some issues when you look back over the last few years. So, I just, media interviews are media interviews. We don't negotiate in the media.
Yeah.
And I mean, it goes back to what Dennis said of it's about leverage. And no one who is the holder of power, if they have enough power, will willingly give up that power. It is given up when they don't actually hold all the power and they need that leverage. And so we have this opportunity right now, and we need to come
I,
at it from every angle.
and I saw a comment earlier. I think it was Joanne's comment about could this be an issue in the next election, however it turns out? Damn right it could. And that's the leverage over time changes. And that's what elections are all about. And but at this moment in time, we have a real opportunity to test what the NDP caucus as a whole wants to see happen. And that's up to you guys. And I'd really appreciate the efforts all of you will make to reach out to MLAs to express your support for doing this work now. And phone calls, letters to MLAs, talking to them, hearing what their thoughts are, really listening to what their thoughts are, because as Dennis was saying, the case has been made and won for PR, and it's a question of how do we help the process through the leverage we have to get to that point in that moment where we actually be the first jurisdiction in Canada that does this. And I'm really confident we can do it. When it's going to happen, I have no idea. But it's going to happen, and it's going to happen when we all least expect it.
After every single episode of voting system reform, somebody has come out and said, well, that's the end. That's it. We're done. Everyone's finished with this topic. And then miraculously, the topic seems to come back. And it's because the topic is responding to the actual conditions we are facing. We are facing the fact that people across the country are unhappy with the restricted number of choices that they face. They're tired of being put in the box the first past the post puts them in. And they have forced their way out of that box at great cost. We've seen an expansion of the party system in places we never expected to see it. New Brunswick, PEI. Oh my God, how striking. We've seen Greens elected in Ontario. We've seen all kinds of things occur that we didn't expect to see. And it's that increase in the size of the party system that is forcing the politicians to have to answer. So sure, you're going to hear all kinds of people say, oh, your issue's garbage. Nobody cares about that. They always say that sort of thing. What you need to do, what we all need to do, is read the tea leaves of what's going on in the elections, because that's where we'll see our openings. And it's absolutely crucial that we steer away from the two-partyism that we saw in the last federal election, because the best chance we have of making our breakthrough is to see the party system become more robust and more competitive. That's where parties then have to actually broker deals. If they win phony majority governments, they don't have there's no reason for them to offer anything. But if they don't have all the power, well, then that gives us some of the power.
And it's, we've been working at this for a while, and it feels like we're still doing the same old thing. We're not doing the same old thing. When the Citizens Assembly was first launched, most British Columbians did not know anything about alternate voting systems, all the different options. They were just like, there's one way the rules run. So to go from that, where proponents of voting reform were sort of seen as like wacky and fringe, to go to a point where the Fair Vote Canada polling shows that it has the support of a majority of Canadians. And so, yes, we keep cycling through some of the same mechanisms, but every time we're getting closer and closer and closer, and we shouldn't just get discouraged when we're getting close to the end game.
Exactly. Don't take no for an answer when it comes to politicians telling us no, or media pundits telling us forget it. This year we wrote a debate piece in Alberta Views, and the no side a lady from the Fraser Institute, opened with something like, you have to give electoral reformers credit. They are relentless. And that's exactly what we are. We are relentless. I know that
Be relentless.
she didn't mean it as a compliment, but I took it as a compliment. So I'm going to wrap up here by reminding people what you can do. Yeah, all of us talking together in this webinar for an hour, it's been great. It's terrific. Okay. It doesn't mean anything if you don't go out and do something to help us right now. So the things that you can do to help right now. Best thing, try to visit your BC NDP MLA. Get in touch with me if you want to visit them. It takes just a lot of persistence, like calling, emailing their office until you can see if you can get that face-to-face or virtual visit. That's by far the best thing. Second best thing, call your MLA office, leave them a message, tell them that you've read the report of the special committee and that you would really like the government to see the government act on this recommendation for a citizens assembly. Third thing you can do is send your MLA an email. It's worth doing. Sometimes emails kind of get backlogged and ignored, but they need to be hearing from lots of people, way more people than they expected. That's part of how we got this far this time, is because they heard from way more people who were way more clear than I think the government expected going in. So let's ramp it up and see how far we can take this in the next 3 or 4 weeks. All right, so I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. And when you log off the Zoom, it'll go to a page. It'll just reiterate the different things you can do. And if you have any questions, feel free to get in touch with me and I'll put you in touch with
Anita,
whoever.
someone's saying remember the phone banking as well. I don't know if you want to plug that.
Thank you, Shoni. I'm living and breathing this phone bank, but of course, do I remember it right now? Okay. If you want to help with the phone banking, there should be a link in the chat to things that you can do. If not, when you log out, you'll hit a page with a link where you can join the BC phone bank. So what we are doing is we are calling our own supporters in BC NDP MLA ridings and asking those people to please contact their BC NDP MLA. So that one-to-one connection with people will get more people to write and to call. But there's so many people that Faribault Canada can't reach. So I'm sure all of you have a friend, an aunt, a grandparent, a kid that lives in a riding with a BC NDP MLA. It takes 20 seconds to call that answering machine and to leave a message. And if everybody does that, we're going to multiply our impact and they are going to be hearing about it and taking the message upstairs.
And can I just sort of touch? There's two things I want to do. First of all, I just want to really thank everybody on this call, and particularly you, Anita, for all of this amazing work in raising the profile in this time of the special committee's work. And it's and I just want to come back to the second point. So first of all, a huge thank you, because you've kept this on the front burner, and here we are with it on the front burner in a really good way right now, and we have this opportunity to get across the finish line on a citizens assembly. But the second point I want to make is that all of you are bringing forward the views of the majority of people in this province through eco polls, through the number of submissions to the committee, through all of the people you talk to. This isn't just a little Fair Vote Canada operation. This is actually you're bringing forward the views and wishes of British Columbians all through British Columbia. And so don't let yourself get pigeonholed as, oh, Christ, here we go. We got another Fair Vote Canada advocate. No, you're just helping the government know that there's broad-based support to do this extra work. And that is so important.
Exactly. People have busy lives and they're not all as tuned in and engaged as we are to take that step to call, but you're calling really on behalf of millions of people, who were disappointed and discouraged with previous set up to fail attempts, the federal broken promise, people that want a voice in democracy, people who have voted their entire lives and never had their vote count for anything. When that phone call you're making to the MLA's office is speaking on behalf of a lot of people that want change. All right. Thank you very much, everyone. And thanks for joining us. Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Dennis. Thank you, Shoni, for taking your time to help encourage us in this next leg of the journey.
Okay.
Great.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.